Dear friend, you can grow your personal and business brand by creating a strong network through podcasting. Create real human connections, have the ability to share your story and interesting point of view. To get started, you can make use of the special offer for friends of this podcast, which is on kitcaster.com/mirror. kitcaster.com/MIRROR. The link and further instruction or details will be found in the show notes for this episode. Thank you. Don't forget to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or whatever platform you listen to this on. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Mirror Talk Podcast. Your moment of greatness starts now. Today's guest is an award-winning professor and a transformational coach for entrepreneurs, pastors, and spiritually minded professionals. He's the author of 4 books, including his forthcoming Centering Prayer, How Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life. You can find out more about Centering Prayer and Brian's new book at www.centeringprayerbook.com. Welcome to the show, Brian. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Toby. Thank you so much for the privilege of being here today. It's great to meet you, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you and your audience.
Thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of Mirror Talk. I've been looking forward to this conversation since the last time we connected, about 4 weeks ago or a month ago that we connected. And I'm looking forward to, hearing about your life journey so far. In your book, you wrote that you lived most of your life by Descartes' words, which says, I think, therefore I am. So please, can you share your life story with me, as well as how you became a practitioner of centering prayer?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm a professor, so I've been a professor of biblical studies for 23 years now, and 21 years in a row now. And so, when I go back to my earliest memories, even as a child, I've always been really good at school. Very good student, and I learned how to read when I was very young. So I was reading adult books when I was like 6 or 7 years old. And I actually was drawn to teaching and wanted to be like a researcher even when I was a small child. Now, obviously, I got into other things as I got older, but it's interesting that I've always been kind of wired to be really good at school, to think, to read, to study, and then to share those with other people. And that's it served me really well for most of my life. But the challenge for me was essentially, and I in my book I talk about Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am," that I basically say I lived in my head, and so the world that I lived in was just a world of ideas and thoughts that were going on in my head. And like I share when I share my story, it's like that worked great as a professor, but it didn't work so great in my own, my personal life. And I'm also been a pastor, and obviously pastors have lots of theology and ideas about God, and we preach and we teach, and all those things are great too, except a lot of times the picture that we have in our mind about maybe what God's like or the way that a church should be run, it doesn't always match up with reality. So I always had this kind of a disconnect in my life, and all that came to a boiling point back in 2010. So it's been a little over 10 years now, when I'd been in a 20-year marriage, and all of a sudden my wife didn't want to be married anymore. And again, I mean, looking back, I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. And I find myself single. I'm a pastor and a seminary professor, and obviously we're not supposed to go through divorces because that's not what you think of with your spiritual leader. So I have this big failing in my life, and I'm also having to be a single parent, because I basically get de facto custody of my kids, and end up having to raise 2 young daughters, more or less by myself. Again, I'm not going to make this about my former wife at all, but I just got put in this really difficult situation. And one day, one of my friends was saying, geez, Brian, it sounds like you're going crazy. And, and I talk kind of fast anyway. And so I think I was just, all I was doing was thinking like, what am I going to do? How am I going to make a comeback? Am I going to lose my job? How am I going to take care of my kids? Am I going to go bankrupt? I just had all of these fears. Is anybody ever going to listen to me again as a teacher or as a pastor? Because I have this, relationship failing. I'm literally getting an F in marriage after, on a grade card. So I just had all this stuff going on. And, and so my friend said, geez, you're going crazy or sound like you're going crazy. So I live in Florida in the United States. So it's pretty much always sunny here. And it happened to be in the springtime. So this is like March or so. And I just go for a walk and, that's like the nicest time of the year in Florida because it hasn't gotten really hot yet. And so I'm walking down the road and, I didn't take my iPod that day. I wasn't, I think those were still before you could have unlimited cell phones. So I wasn't talking on the phone. I'm just walking down the road. And I remember all of a sudden, everything stopped. It felt like just in the split moment. And I heard a bird singing, which obviously I'd heard birds before, but I remember looking up and all of a sudden everything just looked completely crisp. Like I could see leaves. I saw the bird. I'm seeing flowers on this walk I'd never seen, and the world just stopped for like a split second. And I realized it's like, wow, I've been missing all of this my whole life because I've been thinking all the time and even walking, looking down. And I just had this moment where I was fully present. And I sort of like, I don't know if I heard a voice or imagined this, but I literally just had this experience where I felt like God was saying, Brian, it's going to be okay. I'm enough for you. And there's an enough for everybody else. And you're just going to have to show up. And so that was like almost an invitation to a completely new life. And so that's what I mean. So I kind of moved from, still am, I still teach, I still think a lot. It's not like I don't think and use my brain. We're having this conversation, but I realized that if my rest of my life is going to be about, not just ideas, but actually living the ideas out in the real world and testing all the ideas against, about real life. So I'm not just interested in teaching now about what I'm teaching. I'm interested in teaching the how. How do we actually live out this wonderful life that, I would say God has given us the privilege of enjoying. So, I mean, that's kind of a long answer, but that's kind of why I introduced myself that way and how I got into, kind of how I've actually even ended up on your podcast now, because I've been reflecting on this for like, looking back, I've, spent a lot of time reflecting on what happened. And that's just kind of led me on a just really interesting growth journey.
Yes. And before we go now, I would really love you to tell me how how you dealt with that situation in which, as a spiritual leader, a professor, a pastor, dealing with divorce. How was that like for you? How were you able to deal with that and overcome that situation or that phase of your life?
Yeah, well, it's great. Well, thank you. And I had that's a pretty long answer, but I'll just summarize. I mean, the things that really helped me was I took it as a gift in this way, because that was the only thing I could do. Because for a long time, I was like, oh my gosh, I just wanted to hide. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed, felt guilty. I was afraid. I mean, so I had guilt, shame, fear. And so my goal the whole time was, I'm like, okay, because I was 41 when this all happened. And I thought, okay, I'm 41. And at some level, this kind of stinks that this has happened to me because, like, geez, I'm 41, so I'm going to have to start my whole life over. But then I thought, okay. And somehow I just thinking long term, I wanted to make a comeback. I knew I was going to be invited to be the 2.0 version of myself or the 3.0 version. And so I was thinking, okay, I'd love to be in another relationship at some point, but obviously I got a failing mark on this first one. And by the way, again, it takes, there's always two people, there's two sides to everything. But like the thing that helped me was I decided, Toby, that the divorce was 100% my fault. Now, I'm not saying, I mean, that probably isn't true for people who are keeping score at home, but I decided I was going to own it.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to just be a victim of what happened. And so I was going to use this for growth. And my goal was, again, I wish this wouldn't have happened, but I'm going to come out on the other side of this a better man and not a
Mm.
bitter man.
Yeah.
And so,
Yes.
I just kind of opened myself up to growth because nothing feels good. I'm grieving, I'm scared, I'm ashamed, I'm guilty, and feeling guilty. And so I just opened myself up. I would say open myself up to God just to cleanse me, show me
Mm.
the darkness in my own life, bring it all into light so that I can be healed, that I can grow, and that I can be a great father for my two daughters. And cool thing about my kids, they were 9 and 10 when this all started. And, they're both, one of my daughters just graduated from college. So I got her through college, and my other daughter's on the verge of graduating in just, another semester. So I kind of
Mm.
succeeded in that. So, so I focused on my own growth. I focused on not being afraid just to open up to see all of my blind spots. And again, I'm not going to pretend like I have no blind spots now because I'm still growing, but it was just, I'm not going to be afraid to take a deep look at myself and change anything that needs to be fixed because I wanted to be a
Yeah.
better person on the other side. And I guess that mindset is what really helped. Now, obviously, I had great friends. Being a pastor and a seminary professor, I mean, I just had all kinds of wonderful men and women reached out to me that had been former students, that had been my colleagues, other
Mm.
pastors. So I got to experience, unconditional acceptance, unconditional love, encouragement. People reached out to me. So I didn't do this by myself. And so, at the end of the story is I would say, looking back, I wouldn't have wished that on myself or on anybody else, but it was actually a real blessing. And I'm also happy to say, um, because of the work I was able to do, I am happily remarried now, and I met a wonderful woman who is kind of in a similar place to me, and we've just we've been together 8 years now, and it's been a transformational, loving relationship that obviously we always joke we wish we would have met when we were 20, but it didn't work
Yeah.
out that way. But that's kind of how I moved forward and how I addressed that, but it was just essentially being 100% open to growth and not making any excuses for what happened. It wasn't about what my former spouse did. It was how am I going to respond and how am I going to show up and how am I going to set myself up to be a better man long term.
Yes, I really admire that, positive mindset to grow through a difficult situation and come out of it as a better person. That's really awesome. And that's why you're here today also to, to educate me or to talk to me about, centering prayer.
Yeah.
So can you tell me what your definition for centering prayer is, and what is the difference between centering prayer and meditation?
Yeah, and it really centering prayer is you can call it meditation. It's you can also call it silent meditative prayer. But I sometimes I just tell folks it's a Christian form of meditation, and so centering prayer that just to do it, I can make a really simple. It's pretty easy to explain what to do. And then the practice itself, obviously, it takes patience and stuff. But essentially, what you do to do a centering prayer. This comes out of Christian practice all the way back to really the earliest church. There were men and women. Once Christianity became legal, they wanted more. They wanted deeper relationships. So they withdrew out of society and they went into the deserts of like Egypt and say Syria, Palestine area. And these would be the men and the women that started monasteries. These were their first. I don't think they called themselves nuns and monks yet, but that's what they would have become. And they the practice of sitting in silence really goes back in the Christian world, at least to those persons. Centering prayer was a lay movement started in around 1970 within the Roman Catholic Church, but it has its deeper roots. And basically what you do is you just, I usually recommend people try to do this for about 20 minutes. You can do it for any amount of time, shorter or longer. And you sit with your eyes closed. And the whole goal is I'm going to sit, in my intention as a Christian, is I'm going to sit with God in God's presence, and I'm going to surrender whatever goes through my head to God and just sit in silence. Now, anybody that's ever tried meditation or sitting in silence know that the goal isn't to become thoughtless, because that you just can't turn your brain off. But the centering prayer practice is whenever you find yourself in a thought, and those thoughts could be anything from, geez, I wonder if I set my timer, or wow, I hear a bug buzzing around my ears, or I hear a lawnmower outside, or I have a great idea about what I'm going to do when I'm done, or some disturbing thing shows up. I mean, you get all kinds of things going through your head, but what you do is you use a word. That's where the centering comes from. You have a word that you use. I usually use Jesus, but it's recommended to use just a short word, like love or peace or joy or God, whatever you like. And you just use that word when you find yourself in a thought. You just sort of to yourself say your prayer word, and that lets you gently return to your intention, which is just to sit in silence with God. And that is the goal. The goal is just the practice. And then the cool thing that happens sometimes, and the really transformational thing that happens, is the types of thoughts that you have that come up, you're surrendering them. So especially when you have fearful thoughts or painful memories, instead of suppressing those, you're just using your centering prayer word to release those. So in a way, you're releasing the junk in your life to God. And then in between the thoughts, I mean, we're talking about just split seconds, you'll have this experience of unconditional acceptance and love. And I would just say that what's happening when that happens, and again, it doesn't happen every time, and sometimes it doesn't happen, I'm not even going to give a timeline, but at certain points, you'll just feel completely loved. And to me, that's God on the other side of our thoughts interacting with our souls. So that's what centering prayer is. And you can, if you're familiar with meditation, like mindfulness-based meditation, which has roots in Buddhist practice, and that doesn't make it bad, of course, but it's just a different thing. It's centering prayer is like mindfulness. In that mindfulness, you focus on your breathing. If you've ever been trained in that, you're kind of breathing, and you're told to focus on the breath going in and out of your nostrils as kind of your centering place. And so centering prayer is like that, except you're not using your breath, you use your prayer word. And instead of just, kind of focusing on your breath, you're just sort of focusing and centering prayer on your intention to sit with God. But it is similar to mindfulness. And the other common meditation practice that, some folks will be familiar with would be the transcendental meditation, the TM practice. That's another kind of Eastern form. And what it uses is a mantra. So you have a word, and I guess I don't know if they call it a prayer word or not, but you get a word and you basically just say that word repeatedly, and that becomes your focus. Yeah. And centering prayer is different from that, in that the prayer word, like I said, mine's Jesus. I'm not going Jesus, 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 Jesus as a way to do it. I'm just using that word just to interrupt the thoughts. So that's how I would distinguish it. With the key difference would be the purpose. And, as a Christian, my purpose is to sit with Jesus, whereas these other practices have, sometimes it's just more about self-reflection or kind of inner healing, which is a byproduct of centering prayer, but the goal is to sit with God. So does that make sense, Toby? And do you want to?
Yes, it makes sense. It's like, trying to strengthen your relationship with God, try to communicate with Him, and just remain completely silent and open to what He's going to tell you and what your thoughts are going to tell you to, or what you're thinking about at that moment.
Yeah. And what it is, it builds within the Christian religion. It would build on top of reading the scriptures and regular types of prayers. And it's just about recognizing that there's a God even on the other side of our best thinking, and that God's even bigger than the thoughts that we can have. And we're trying to encounter that God. So it's actually a pretty cool experience. And I've been doing it for years. And that was a key piece of my healing journey. It's that I was trying, when I had that experience that day when I was walking, that I started our conversation telling you about. I want to try to figure out what happened. And it's kind of like I had this contemplative moment. And so what I found is the centering prayer. And then I also do some journaling. I use those two practices, and it's not the same thing as when I was walking, but I realized that's what my soul needed. I needed silence practices. So I just didn't sit around trying to scheme and make up, plans to get myself back on track. It was just, I learned to be, which was just, that's been the game changer for me, just to be present.
Yes. And it's so awesome that, you wrote a book about it, your book titled Centering Prayer, How Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life. And I'm really excited to be talking about the, 5 parts that are in this book. And, it has 22 chapters also. So can you, just tell me a little bit about the book and what inspired you to write the book, apart from the story we had already?
Yeah, well, see, that's what's so fun. I mean, I've been a scholar, and I have written other books. Most of my other books I've written about the Bible. I'm a biblical scholar. I've done some those. If your listeners go to church, I've written like Sunday school lessons that people can use in groups and stuff. So I've always done that kind of stuff, and so I've been writing most of my life. But as part of my healing journey, I had to confront who I really was, and I made a promise to myself. Because I kind of even got sick of just writing about the Bible. It doesn't mean I don't like the Bible anymore, but I was just like, okay, I used to do a lot of stuff just because I was invited or I was expected of me as part of my job. And I just made a promise that I was never going to write anything that I 100% wasn't completely committed to. Again, I'm not suggesting that I've been a fake or anything in my life, because that's not what I mean by that. But I wanted to just do things that I absolutely loved, not just something that I was asked to do or somebody expected me to do. And so what was fun about the centering prayer is I never meant to write the book. I just sat down and I would just, write. I like to write about 500 words a day. That's always my goal. And so I just started writing about my experiences with centering prayer. I'd been doing some reading. I've read some other books on it. And I just, I literally started writing, Toby, and then writing and writing and writing. And I ended up with 60,000 words.
Wow.
in these basically little 500 to 1,000 word, almost like blog posts. And you've seen the book. And so even though it has a lot of chapters, some of the chapters are pretty short. They were like these little snippets that I did. And the whole book really isn't that long, but I wrote these little small pieces and I had all this stuff and I'm like, wow, I think there's a book here. And I just started, I did it's all on a word processor, but I had all these pieces. So I printed it all out and I just put it in kind of an order and then did an edit on my own little isolated pieces. And so this book, and that's what's I'm so excited about it. And it was just pure joy because it just flowed out of me. Yes. I shared it with friends and people liked it. I mean, I did a lot of editing, so it's not even 60,000. It's not 60,000 words anymore. It's literally, I think it's closer to like 40,000. So I cut basically 1/3 out of the stuff that I wrote, had some good editing. So I just distilled it down to the real nuggets. And then the other cool thing is, when you write books, you got to find a publisher, and that's not always easy. And, I can just say, you're looking at a guy, Toby, that failed repeatedly as an author, because I've been turned down for different books that I've done in the past a lot. It's not easy. The publishing was never easy for me. But what was amazing is I'd given my rough draft to one of my old mentors, and he really liked it. And I said, hey, who should we send this to? Or he told me I should publish. I'm like, well, who should I publish a book like this with? Because I'm a Bible professor, so I'm not sending it to some academic biblical studies press. I needed to find like a spiritual formation or, a spirituality publisher. And I didn't have contacts. And at some level, I don't even have, I'm not a spiritual formation professor, so I don't even have the academic credentials. And so, but my friend reached out to somebody and he said, hey, send it to Paraclete Press. And I'm like, cool. So this was literally my first choice. And this is why this was awesome. I wrote the book proposal up, sent it to Paraclete, and they took it right off the bat. So for the first time in my entire life, I'd had no rejections on this book either. So it was like total joy to write.
Yeah.
All the doors have kind of opened up. I mean, even on your podcast today, this has just been so fun. People are interested. And so it's just been a total blessing to let this book kind of flow out into the world. And I'm just super excited to see what's going to happen with it. And, and then the cool thing is I'm not really even nervous. I'm just excited, and I have just a real sense of freedom. Whatever happens, I did my part. I mean, this book literally just flowed through me, and, you've looked at, I put some really personal stuff in the book.
Yes.
So it's both kind of it's a how to do centering prayer. And I get down to the nitty gritty in there, and I really, share some of the real healing that can take place. And I use myself as kind of an example, and I try to be fairly transparent about some of the things that happened to me. And so it's, that's kind of how the book came about, and I'm just super happy. It comes out, September. So about another 6 weeks, the book's going to be live. Yeah.
Yes. We're looking forward to it. Like in fall, September 2021, we're going to be reading Centering Prayer from Brian Russell.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And obviously, like you said, you can look at centeringprayerbook.com, and I'll send you some information. It's available they're pre-selling on Amazon. Again, I know you're in Germany. I don't know how that works overseas, but I know it's available. It's probably available overseas. I have no idea, but it's definitely available on Amazon in the United States.
In the 21st century that we are in right now, why is the practice of silence or solitude, why is it very important in this century?
Oh yeah. It's gotten increasingly important just because our world is so noisy, right? That was always there's always something to listen to. There's news to read. We could be on the internet. I mean, and, walking around. I mean, how many people just staring at their phones all the time and don't ever look up? And so what silence and solitude does is it cuts through all that and lets you just be the actual person that you were created to be. Now, that sounds great, but the problem is when you sit in silence and you're not distracted, it can be scary too, because we're coming out of COVID. We were just talking about that before we jumped on here, and again, it's still restricted in some countries, but a lot of us have been alone a lot more than we were used to, and we all know what that felt like. It felt weird. It was super hard. I mean, I've noticed, at least in the United States, that, people have been a little bit more disagreeable with each other for sure than they have in the past. There's more anxiety. And so silence is a great thing because it can be healing, but it also can be really scary. And, in my book, I have a quote from Nietzsche, which I should have already looked it up here, but actually I'll just try to summarize it because I don't have my book right in front of me, but he talks about, most of us like to numb ourselves with activities, lest when we're alone, someone or something gets whispered into our ear. And so that's what silence does. Silence lets us see ourselves. Silence lets us kind of look at our deeper motivations. Silence shows us the hurt parts of ourselves. You'll sometimes, if you sit in silence long enough, I mean, if you have anger issues, anger stuff will come up in your head. You'll think about people that did you wrong. I mean, when the men and women that went out into the desert and started doing the silence practices, like men, in Christianity, there's always been this whole push against like sexual temptation and stuff. And what was interesting, like some of the early monks, they basically in their minds, they're giving everything up for God, and they're out in silence and they're away from all temptations. There's no women around or anything. And these guys, they still got their brains. And so they're having these like sexual thoughts in their mind. And so, you can get anger, sex, greed, pride, sadness, sloth, like these get the things that are considered to be the 7 deadly sins in like Christian practice. All those came out of monks in silence, looking at their inner world and seeing that those things come with you. And so in a sense, silence is so powerful and so important is because, if we want to move ahead and become, a more just societies in our world, if we want to be better husbands and wives, fathers, sons, daughters, family members, employees, we have to allow ourselves to be healed of all the junk on the inside so we can literally just show up and, be the loving, powerful people that I would say God created us to be. But in silence is the kind of the key that helps us to heal versus, our temptation today is just to be distracted all the time and not grow.
Yes. So silence helps in our, inner purification and helps us to heal also and get rid of, every filth that we might be having inside of us.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, it is. It's like a it's pure. It is. It's silence is about purification. If we're intentional about it, and like these meditation practices, and even a really powerful journaling practice, it can be it can facilitate that.
Yes, yes. So for someone out there who is listening and saying, okay, but where can I find this in the Bible actually? Like, are there like some theological or biblical foundation for centering prayer? Can you explain this to us?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a super fair question because obviously I can't give you a verse that says go, do centering prayer because that's not mentioned. But what I would suggest for a biblical basis for this would be a couple of things. Like in 2 Corinthians, Paul gives a command. He talks about taking every thought captive, for example. And that's really interesting, right? So like, how do you take your thoughts captive? Well, the first thing you have to do is become aware that you're actually having thoughts. And so centering prayer can facilitate what Paul is talking about. You also have the example of Jesus. And again, I'm not suggesting necessarily that Jesus went out and sat in silence, but we do know that Jesus always withdrew, went to quiet places, and it said he prayed, and obviously pray with words, but we can also assume that he was just sitting in silence some of the times. Another great kind of biblical basis for this, and this gets quoted a lot, would be that Psalm 46, where it says, "Be still and know that I'm God." Again, that particular psalm, again, they're not necessarily thinking about meditation. They're really just thinking about a noisy, crazy world, but just stopping and knowing that, and being silent. So there's a basis there. And one of the fun ones, and I talk about this in my book, again, this isn't necessarily about centering prayer, but it can be a biblical basis, is a lot of folks probably remember the story about Elijah, the prophet in the Old Testament. And he has a famous conflict with Queen Jezebel, who was King Ahab's wife, and there's a big conflict between the prophets of Baal, and then Elijah defeats them and has them killed, and then Jezebel wants to kill Elijah, so he has to flee, and he leaves Israel and he flees all the way back to the desert where Mount Sinai was, and there's this memorable scene where he thinks he's the only one, and God says, "No, you're not the only one." And then Elijah has to go outside of his cave, and then it says there's a fire, but God wasn't in the fire. Then there's a wind, God isn't in the wind, and so you have these dramatic, powerful manifestations of nature, and it says God wasn't there. And then in the most English translations, I don't know how the German sounds, but like the English translation, it talks about that. Elijah, and then he doesn't see God in the spectacular. He hears God in this still, small voice, or this quiet voice. In the Hebrew there, it's really interesting, Toby. It really just says Elijah encountered God in the silence.
Yeah.
And so again, was Elijah doing centering prayer? Not necessarily, but God was there in the silence. So those would be some ways to think about that biblically. And you might even say that pray without ceasing that Paul also talks about in 1 Thessalonians. This gives you a way of kind of living your whole life in prayer, because you can do the centering prayer for 20 minutes, but as you go about your day, you can just, whenever you get a little pause, like when I'm driving, when I'm sitting at a red light, I'll just kind of think about my thoughts, and I'll just kind of quietly release them to God. You can do it. So you can kind of do this throughout the day. So those would be some of the biblical bases for that, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It does. And how can centering prayer help me to get rid of the false ideas about God, for example, or to get rid of, toxic beliefs that the world has impacted upon me.
Yeah. That's the most interesting thing, is that your view of God gets bigger, and the way that centering prayer helps with toxic beliefs. Like I mentioned, I like to talk about what I call the unholy trinity: fear, shame, and guilt. And most of us struggle with all three of those, or at least one of those three. And they kind of manifest as I'm afraid that I'm not going to have enough. I feel guilty that I don't do enough. And I feel shame that because I just don't feel like I'm good enough. And what the centering prayer does is, by the very fact that we surrender what comes out of our basically our minds, out of our unconscious. And again, it's no big deal to, like when I'm thinking, geez, I wonder if I set my timer, that's an irrelevant thought to just release. But the way that God uses centering prayer to deal with our toxic beliefs is through, I think, what God allows to come to our minds. And so, like I mentioned a little bit about like those 7 deadly sins, like I know early on, I had to confront the fact that I had a lot of anger that was suppressed in me, and that was coming off of being divorced and just feeling like, geez, I'd been done wrong. And so, that people that I was upset with would just come into my mind while I'm supposed to be praying. And even before, if you don't catch your thoughts, you can easily, a thought just becomes, you just kind of reimagine what you would have done if you could have gone back in the situation, what you would have said differently and stuff. And then you're like, and then you just realize, like, oh my gosh, I'm thinking this stuff and I'm in God's presence. And then you're like, whoa. But then the way you get healed is then you realize, like, wow, I just had this really bad, disturbing thought. And I know that God knows that I just had that thought, and God hasn't left, and I'm just sitting here. And so maybe I ought to forgive myself too for having these kind of thoughts. And so you slowly release the junk on the inside, whatever you struggle with, you just become aware of it instead of pushing it back down in embarrassment. There's the scene in Genesis at the very beginning of the Bible where Adam and Eve, they eat the fruit, with the story with the serpent. And I don't know if you know the story, Toby, but some of your listeners remember that Adam and Eve, they go and hide in the woods, and then God comes down, right? And then God comes looking for him. And it's kind of like that in centering prayer. You have this thought and like, whoa, maybe I need to go hide. But then you think, I can't hide. I'm just sitting here in silence. And so it's the process of being confronted with our own junk and then surrendering it to God. Because there's 4 R's that go with the centering prayer. That it's retain no thought. So when I realize that I'm thinking, I release it. Resist no thought. And so no matter how good or bad it is, we just let it be. React to no thought, especially the disturbing ones, right? Like, I'm really mad, or maybe you have a sexual thought, or you have a greedy thought or a prideful thought. You just don't react, and you just gently return. And it's by that process of just surrendering that God, I think, just slowly unclogs. I like to think of my insides as just pipes. So it's like God's like a plumber that just gets all the junk out of the pipes by us surrendering those things to him. And the healing experience is that, like I mentioned earlier, that you feel known by by God who's bigger than you. I mean, just this immense, and you feel loved. And that's what the healing part is, when you realize the most painful parts of yourself are there for God to see, and you can release them. That's what really frees you, Toby. And so, from doing this for all these years now, and it's almost been 10 years of doing this meditation practice. I kind of know myself a lot better than I ever did, because and what's interesting is, I feel less holy than I probably used to think I was, while at the same time I feel more loved. And so it's like I'm more comfortable with being myself and being free then to show up, to share all this stuff with you and your listeners. I'm a better teacher. I'm a much better husband than I ever was. I'm a better father because I know myself and I know that God knows me and that God loves me and God accepts me. And that just puts me in a position where, I can just be an ambassador of that same love and abundance with other people now that I've learned from sitting in silence. So, that may have been too long of an answer, but that's kind of how God heals you, I think, and gets rid of the toxic
Yes.
stuff.
Yeah. So, that means silence and solitude helps you to move from, your fear, your guilt, your shame, and all those evil thoughts, and helps you to live fully in God's stream for your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I got from that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It helps you to feel comfortable and confident in the love of God for you also.
Yeah, and that's the game changer, because you're free then. Because if you're loved by God, you're just invited then to show up. Like one of my own mentors had told me, and for years, and it really made sense after I'd been doing the centering prayer. He always just said the key to life was showing up, paying attention, and knowing that God has way more invested in this than you do. And so and so you're just kind of free to be a vehicle of God's love to other people then.
That's true. That's very true. So, in part 4 of your book, you write about confronting the false self.
Yeah.
And can you explain this to me? How can we overcome the enemy within, and how can we break through into our true self?
Yeah. It's essentially, and it's similar to what I said is when you sit in silence again, you're going to be confronted with your fears, your shame, your guilt. And that's what our false self actually is. It's our false self is who we are when we attempt to make it through the world just out of our own resources apart from God. And, we become, we grow into our false self basically while we're growing up, because it's the false self is who you have to become to get the love that everybody desires. And so it ends up being like, what do I have to do to get love versus, and the healing part then is realizing there's nothing you have to do to be loved, that God is love and that God loves you. So that's the shift. And so it's just the silence lets you confront essentially who you've become on your own. And then what it's inviting you to do is just to become who God wants you to be, which is a person who's loved by God. And then, that doesn't mean we don't do stuff, but the doing then flows out of, at our core, knowing that we're already loved. Our doing isn't about trying to prove that we're worthy of love or trying to earn love or living in a way that's false to who we really are because we think that somebody won't like us if we just show them who we really are.
Yes, that's true. So that means that way we can also discover God's will for our life.
Yeah.
Or how can we do that? How can we do that?
Yeah. And and I would say, when we talk about God's will, that's such a great question, because everybody wants to kind of know what's the thing that I really need to do, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And so, if I would, in essence, and I think this is just quoting the scriptures back, and I don't mean this as a simplistic answer, even a question that are attempting to avoid the specifics, the specificity of the question. But really, what God's will is for each one of us is to love God with all that we are, and to love everyone else just as much as we love ourselves. And so I would talk about God's will in terms of essentially growing in love. And when you and I grow in love, we actually are living out God's will, because we're going to manifest that in the world. And it essentially starts, it starts with, there's 3 loves. It's, love your neighbor as yourself. So it's loving yourself, loving your neighbor, and then obviously loving God. And, I talk about this in the book. There was a important medieval figure named Bernard of Clairvaux. He's known as Saint Bernard of Clairvaux now. He started one of the, I think the Cistercians. It's a Roman Catholic order, but it goes back to the 11th century. And Bernard talked about these 4 levels of love. And so, in talking about God's will, and if growth and love is the God's will, it's interesting that these levels kind of correspond to our own growth. And and like the lowest level of love would be loving yourself for your own sake, which
Yes.
is that'd be narcissism, or just it's just selfishness essentially. And that's where most of us at some level, at some point in our lives, it's really where it's about us, and we love ourselves for our own sake.
Yeah.
But then if you begin if you encounter God in some way, then you kind of a lot of times we start off, we love God for what God does for us, right? So I'm going to love God, and if I love God, I'm going to have a great life, and maybe I'll be healthy and wealthy and wise. But then as you grow a little bit more and you deepen your spirituality, you're like, okay, that's still a little bit selfish, loving God just for what God can do for me. I need to love God for who God
Jesus.
is, right? And so you grow, and okay, I'm going to love God for who God is. But then and this is the cool thing, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it eventually at first. But Bernard said there's even a deeper love than loving God for who God is. And this is where it's interesting. It almost like it gets back to the beginning. Bernard said the highest expression of love is loving yourself for God's sake. And that's crazy, because it almost sounds like loving yourself for your own sake, but it's loving God for God. And so it's or loving yourself for God. I'm sorry, that's the highest level. And so it's like it's getting to the point where you see yourself as God sees you, and you 100% accept yourself, open yourself up to that. And that's the highest level of love. And so I would say God's will for us is to get into that highest level of love where we can love ourselves for the sake of God. And when you get to that place of real deep growth, there's not selfishness involved in it at all. You're living and being focused on being and living as the person that God created you to be, and then just sharing that abundance with the world. And so that's what I would say God's will is for us, to grow in love.
Yes, yes. Wow, that's so awesome. Like when you are talking about it, I was like, yes, God created us. We are God's precious creation, and God loves us so much.
Yeah.
So it's our responsibility, or God will want us to love what He loves so much, which is us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to love ourselves for God's sake, because God loves us so much. Yeah, with everything that He has, and all of His power.
And the biggest challenge for most of us, Toby, or at least I'll speak for myself, is like, even if you've grown up in church and you've heard this stuff about God's love, a lot of times we don't really believe it. So we think, well, God loves the person next to me, or God loves my kids, but do I really know deep down inside that God loves me and that God has my best interests at heart? I mean, and that's the challenge, and that's where the fear, the guilt, and the shame, they block us. That's the enemy within that blocks out us essentially getting to the point. And there's a theologian named Paul Tillich. He talks about grace being accepting the fact that you're unconditionally accepted. And that's the breakthrough, freeing moment when we open ourselves up so much to God's love that, it breaks through our guilt, our shame, our fear, and we can see ourselves as God sees us. We can love ourselves as God loves us. And then that opens us up to, have great conversations, to be, like I like to say, we can become ambassadors of God's love and abundance to every single person that we meet.
So from your experience, and from everything we've heard about centering prayer right now, how can we develop like a very healthy rhythm for spiritual practices that we can consistently practice every day of our lives, to become much more centered in God and continue to build our relationship with God every day? How can we do that?
Yeah, and it involves some intentionality, and again, people are at different stages of life, and like if you have small kids, sometimes it's not so easy to get those moments of quiet because the kids are always running around and stuff. So we have to recognize that. But it's basically what I would suggest if people are really listeners are really interested in trying, is look at your calendar because how you keep your calendar, your schedule is critical. And I would say, say to yourself mentally, I need to block out time to invest in my own deep spiritual formation. And so, like for me, I do it first thing in the morning. I've been working at the house pretty much the last year, so it's easy. But even when I used to go to my office, I would go early and I would do my centering prayer before I started my work in my office. And so
Yeah.
it's about intentionally saying, I'm going to treat this like maybe it's my most important appointment every day. I'm going to do the habits that fuel me for long-term growth. And a lot of folks, times people will say, no, I don't have time. That's why it's so important just to get it on your calendar, make an appointment with yourself, and then just do it consistently. But you want to find, the right time in your day, and everybody's going to be different, but look at your calendar, but then schedule it just in the same way. I think, for spiritual practices, you make sure everybody needs to take some kind of like day off. I mean, I'd call it a Sabbath, and you got to schedule that. You need to schedule time with, if you have a family, with your family, put your work in around there, and then make sure you've also scheduled in your practices, and then just be consistent with them. And the key is centering prayer is a habit, and it's kind of like going to the gym. And so it isn't, don't listen to me talk about all the stuff that's happened and say, oh, this is going to happen right off the bat. It takes time. And so just like kind of going to the gym and saying, I'm going to lift weights, you don't see, other than your muscles might get sore off the bat. You're not going to turn into like a guy that can do Olympic weightlifting in like a week or whatever, but you're just going to do the habit, and you'll notice over time, profound changes. So be patient, but schedule it and do it consistently for a season to see if it's going to work. Like I would say that if you're going to do the centering prayer, you should try to commit to doing it. I'd even start with 5 minutes. Just say I'm going to do it 5 minutes every single day. I'm going to do it for a month to see what happens. And then slowly increase. Because that's what I did. When I first started, I started with really small amounts of time and slowly got longer. Some people also would find, you may want to just jump in feet first and say, I'm just going to do 20 minutes off the bat, but just pick a time and then consistently do it. Because one of the principles of spiritual formation or any habits is this: small habits done consistently over time yield extraordinary results. And I can pretty much promise everybody that if you do a centering prayer practice, silent meditative practice, it will compound in your life over time if you consistently practice it. So I don't know if I answered your question, but those would be some of the tips that I would give.
You give, exactly. Yeah, yes. So from your vast years of experience, like what will you give us listeners as like a closing remark, for our spiritual growth, or for, to have a much more better life, to be able to overcome circumstances of life, or just to grow and become what God wants us to be?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I would say this, a couple things. The first thing is, I think a great question that we want to ask ourselves is, what in my life am I presently tolerating that is preventing me from thriving and flourishing? So I think it starts with telling ourselves the truth, right? And so like that I need to grow, I need to get rid of this thing. So that's so important. It's just to be open, honest, and take responsibility for that. So that would be the first thing I would say. And, and then the second thing is, you might just start if you're a person of faith, or you're just not even sure, why not just pray something like, God, astonish me. I'm here. I want to experience all that you have for me, and just, come and be with me as I sit in silence. And then, maybe person finishes listening to the podcast and like, you know what, I'm just going to set my timer for 5 minutes after, Toby signs off today. And I'm going to just try a 5 minute sitting in silence and just kind of see what happens. Because that would be the second thing. And then the third thing I would say is, you want to look at your life and again, imagine where you'd like to be in 10 years or 25 years even. So like, like when I was telling my story earlier, I wanted to be better, not bitter. Now, I didn't know exactly what that was going to mean, but
Yes.
I already had this growth piece, right? And
Yeah.
so then once you decide you want to grow, you want to think about, I mentioned that tolerations question. You want to think, okay, what are negative things that I need to cut out of my life?
Mm.
That's like in sports, like we were talking about soccer or football before we started, and in
Yes.
football, everybody's both offense and defense, right? You have to defend when you don't have the ball. You try to score when you do have the ball. So it's like
Yeah.
soccer's a great metaphor for this. And so you
Mm.
want to think in your own spiritual life, offense and defense.
Mm.
So I want to do positive practices so I can score goals and win the game, right? That's like
Yeah.
centering prayer, or reading good books, hanging around really good, powerful people, listening to great podcasts like Mere Talk. And then you also want, to have play defense. So you got to get rid of stuff in your life that's pulling you away, because here's the reality. You can do centering prayer every single day. But if you have things in your life that don't need to be there, that are sucking your energy, that are causing you pain, that are, abusing you, I mean, you got to get rid of that stuff, and then you can
Yeah.
open yourself up to really what God wants. So again, that's probably more than you wanted to hear, but that's what my closing remarks would be.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Thank you so much. Like, I'm going to place the link to your website in the show notes for this episode. So those who are listening to this before the book is released in September could pre-order for the book already, and those who are listening afterwards could still go to the link and also buy the book on Amazon and every other platform that's going to be available on. I really appreciate everything I'm going to learn from you. But for people out there who are like, yes, I still want to connect with Brian. I still want to ask some questions. Like, what's the best way to connect and work with you?
Yeah, honestly, they can do a couple things. I don't mind sharing my actual email. If they want to send me an email, they can reach out to me directly at deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. And they can also go to my coaching website, drbrianrussellcoaching.com. And there's some ways to
Mm.
connect with me there, but I'd be happy to serve anyone. And obviously the centeringprayerbook.com, that signs up for emails from me about centering prayer, and I'll send you some resources that can help get you started, and even some videos on how to do it. So I'd love to hear from anybody that's interested.
Awesome. That's awesome. That's very great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brian. I really appreciate everything I've been able to learn from you today about silence, about solitude, and about, centering prayer as a whole. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Oh, you're welcome, Toby, and thanks for just a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your interview style and how easy it was to speak with you. So blessings on your work, and hope I hope your audience continues to grow. And thank you for your time.
Wow, you made it to the very end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'm grateful for your time, your love, and your contributions. Subscribe, like, review, and share this podcast. God bless you. Bye.